silence was the worst part. Before the Virac came, the world had always carried a hum, wind through trees, distant city noise, the drone of humanity surviving. Now it was as though the land itself had held its breath in terror. Gideon Graves knelt in the ruins of a farmhouse, the brittle wood snapping under his boots as he adjusted his rifle's scope. Beyond the jagged splinters of what was once a window, the valley stretched out like an exposed wound, raw and barren. And there, nestled in the distance like a monstrous cyst, was Black Hollow Ridge, the alien stronghold. The Virac's fortress was alive. Gideon hated how literal that was. The pulsating structure sprawled across the mountainside, veins of bioluminescent tissue glowing beneath a carapace of warped steel and bone. It expanded and contracted in uneven rhythms, as if it were breathing. Every now and then, a low groan reverberated across the ridge, a grotesque sound like the death rattle of something too massive to die quietly. Gideon exhaled slowly, his breath curling like smoke in the frigid air. His gloved hand brushed over the cold metal of his rifle, tracing the familiar grooves. It was one of the last remaining sniper rifles of its kind, a relic from an era before Earth was consumed by alien horrors. He still remembered the weight of it during his first mission, back when the war still felt like something humanity could win. Now it was just a reminder of how many people had died carrying the same burden. His radio crackled, static hissed in his ear, followed by a familiar voice. Branford, the only other member of his old unit who hadn't been obliterated in the last ambush. "Graves, you there?" Branford's voice was frayed, brittle from too many sleepless nights. Gideon pressed a finger to his earpiece. "I'm here. They're laughing again." Branford's words felt like nails against his skull. Gideon didn't need to ask what he meant. The Virac's mockery wasn't verbal. It came in images, broadcasts of horror. Their most recent message had been found outside the ruins of Ashfall Gorge. Human corpses, flayed and hollowed, woven together like some obscene sculpture. And somewhere in the grotesque tangle of sinew and bone, they had embedded a rifle, a sniper rifle, their way of making a joke. Gideon's jaw tightened. He could still see the faces from that ambush, their expressions frozen in agony as the alien spores devoured them from within. "They don't think we can touch them," Branford continued. "They don't think a sniper's shot matters. Hell, maybe they're right." Gideon glanced toward Black Hollow Ridge again. A sickly green glow shimmered through the thick fog, illuminating the fortress in pulses. It was alive, and it was watching. "They're not right," Gideon muttered. "We just haven't made the right shot yet." The radio was silent for a moment before Branford spoke again, quieter this time. "There's a new development. Intel just came in. The leader, the big one, Akral, he's coming to the ridge. There's a meeting at the command node. If we hit him, it could change everything." Gideon's heart thudded in his chest, slow and heavy. Akral. He had seen the footage, the towering Virac warlord, his body covered in shifting plates of biotic armor that pulsed and retracted like muscle spasms. His mandibles twitched when he spoke, releasing clouds of pheromones that made human soldiers retch and lose their minds. No one had ever gotten close enough to try a shot, and no one had lived long enough to learn his weaknesses. "You're sure it's him?" Gideon asked. Confirmed, Branford replied. He'll be there by dawn. This might be our only chance. Gideon leaned against the broken frame of the farmhouse, feeling the wind bite at the back of his neck. He could already hear the ghosts of his old unit whispering to him, "You won't make it. You'll die like we did." Their faces flashed in his mind, eyes wide with terror, flesh unraveling as alien spores dug into their skin. He clenched his teeth and forced the memories away. "I'll make the shot," Gideon said finally. "You're outnumbered, Graves. There's no backup." Branford's voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it, a quiet plea. "If you miss, or if they catch you, you won't get another chance. I know what they'll do," Gideon interrupted. "I've seen it." The silence stretched between them again. Finally, Branford sighed. "Then I guess I'll see you on the other side." Gideon shut off the radio and stared out at the ridge, letting the cold sink into his bones. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small flask. The liquid inside burned as it slid down his throat, but it steadied his shaking hands. Gideon rose slowly, his joints stiff from crouching for so long. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and began the slow, deliberate climb toward the mountainside. The wind howled around him, carrying the distant hum of something alive, something unnatural. And far above, the fortress pulsed like a cancer in the dark. The war had made him a ghost, but tonight he would make the Virek believe in ghosts too. With each step, he whispered the same mantra under his breath, a quiet promise to the dead. They laughed at us. The wind shifted, and for a moment it almost sounded like someone laughing. Gideon didn't look back. They won't laugh again. The wind cut like a serrated blade as Gideon climbed the jagged trail toward the ridge. The higher he went, the thinner the air became, laced with a bitter metallic tang that clung to his lungs. It wasn't just the altitude, it was the Virek's pollution. Their fortress exhaled streams of toxic mist, thickening the sky with a greenish haze. He pulled his scarf tighter around his face, but it barely dulled the stench of rot and ozone. Lightning forked overhead, followed by the guttural rumble of thunder. Rain began to fall in uneven bursts, each drop sizzling as it hit the stone. Acidic, just as he feared. He reached for the tarp in his pack and slung it over his rifle, shielding the delicate machinery from corrosion. But there was nothing to shield his skin. He winced as the raindrops burned through the fabric of his jacket, leaving tiny holes that began to smolder. Ahead, the trail narrowed to a ridge no wider than a coffin's lid, flanked by sheer cliffs that plunged into darkness. He took it slow, feeling for stable footholds, careful not to look down. His thoughts were like static, fragmented memories of fallen comrades, their faces half dissolved by spores, their screams garbled and wet. He forced himself to focus on the path. The wind changed, carrying a new sound, wet, slithering. Gideon froze. He crouched low, adjusting his position against the stone, his eyes narrowing. Something moved along the edge of the mist, a shadow, elongated and twitching. He reached for his binoculars and raised them slowly. At first, he saw only the fog, shifting like pale tendrils of smoke. Then, as a flash of lightning lit the mountainside, the shapes came into focus. Melders, His stomach turned. The Melders were a horror born from war, a fusion of the dead and the living. Their torsos were human, but their limbs had been replaced with sinewy Virek appendages, jointed like insect legs. Rib cages stretched outward, wrapped in a sickening cocoon of translucent flesh. But it was their faces that unsettled him most, because they still had faces. Their mouths hung open in silent cries, but no sound emerged. Torn muscle quivered across exposed jaws, eyes rolled white. Their bodies twitched unnaturally, as though caught between life and death. There were 5 of them, patrolling the ridge in uneven, jerking strides. The bioluminescent sacs beneath their skin pulsed faintly, giving the illusion that something inside them was wriggling. Gideon gritted his teeth and slipped his rifle from its cover. He couldn't risk alerting the entire fortress by firing. He reached into his belt and retrieved a combat knife, its blade coated in a synthetic resin designed to corrode alien tissue. A Melder paused at the edge of the ridge, its head tilting as though sensing something. The others shifted restlessly behind it. Gideon's muscles tensed. He waited, counting the seconds between heartbeats. When the lightning flashed again, he lunged. The blade sank into the back of the creature's neck with a sickening squelch. The Melder's body spasmed, its limbs flailing wildly before it collapsed. Black ichor gushed from the wound, thick and viscous, coating Gideon's hands. He shoved the corpse over the cliff's edge and watched it tumble into the abyss below. The others heard the impact. They turned as one, heads jerking unnaturally. Gideon dove behind a boulder as the Melders began to screech. A high-pitched, inhuman keening that set his nerves on fire. The sound wasn't natural. It vibrated in his bones, making his vision blur. Stay calm. Focus. One of the Melders scuttled closer, its legs scraping against the stone. Gideon reached into his pack, pulled out a fragmentation charge, and set the timer for 3 seconds. He hurled it toward the creature and pressed himself flat against the ground. The explosion sent a shock wave through the narrow pass, followed by a wet, meaty thump. When he lifted his head, chunks of alien flesh rained down in greasy clumps. The surviving Melders shrieked again, but their cries were no longer coordinated. They moved erratically, their hive mind link severed. Gideon didn't wait for them to regroup. He broke into a sprint, weaving between jagged rocks as the rain fell harder. His legs ached, and his lungs burned with every breath. The acid rain hissed against his exposed skin, blistering his forearms. Still, he pressed on. The ridge widened as he neared the final stretch. Above, the fortress loomed, a grotesque silhouette of warped architecture, tendrils of organic matter spiraling out like the roots of a diseased tree. The path was slick with mud and viscera, and the air felt thicker, almost gelatinous. He was close now, so close he could see the pulsating membranes that covered the outer walls of the command node. The flesh-like structures twitched in time with the fortress's heartbeat, leaking streams of phosphorescent fluid. Then he saw it. A Venquil crouched near the entrance. The creature was quadrupedal, its spine exposed and glistening with rain. Its ribs had split apart into something resembling jaws, each one lined with jagged bone fragments. Its breathing was slow, almost mechanical, as if it were savoring the act of waiting. Gideon slowed his pace, raising his rifle. The Venquil's ears twitched. It sensed him. It turned, eyes like molten amber locking onto his position. He fired. The shot cracked through the storm. The bullet tore through the creature's skull, but it didn't fall immediately. Instead, it lurched forward a few steps, its body convulsing before collapsing into a pool of gore. Gideon didn't stop moving. He sprinted toward the fortress, heart pounding as the walls of living tissue loomed overhead. He reached the outcropping just as another bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the valley below. The Virek stronghold pulsed with alien life, casting its sickly green glow across the mountain. He took cover beneath an overhang and exhaled, forcing himself to steady his breath. His pulse thudded in his ears and his skin burned from the acid rain. But he was here. He'd made it. The shot was coming. And when it came, it would be the last thing Akral ever heard. The storm howled through the mountains like a living thing, clawing at the rock face with icy fingers. Gideon pressed his back against the slick stone, ignoring the acidic sting of rain that dripped from his hood and trickled down his neck. From his vantage point, he could see the grotesque expanse of the Virek fortress below, a seething labyrinth of flesh and steel, pulsating with a sickly green light, its membranes stretched and contracted as if tasting the storm in slow, deliberate breaths. He took in the structure's movements, counting each pulse, each shift in the living walls. The fortress wasn't just breathing, it was listening. It absorbed the air around it, twisting it into something thick and alien. But it didn't matter how alive it was. Nothing was invincible. He slid his rifle from its protective covering, the familiar weight grounding him. He wiped the scope clean with the last dry corner of his scarf and pulled it to his eye. Through the glass, the world sharpened into focus, twisted towers of bone, living battlements coated in slick, sinewy membranes, and in the center of it all, the command node. Gideon's breath caught in his throat. Akral had arrived. The Virek warlord stood at the heart of the command platform, a towering figure encased in shifting plates of biotic armor. His form was humanoid only in silhouette. His torso was a mass of sinew and muscle, threaded with bioluminescent veins, each one throbbing like a heartbeat. Thick, armor-like carapace spiraled across his shoulders and back, twitching and unfurling with each motion. His elongated head glimmered with wet chitin, and twin mandibles clicked as he gestured toward his assembled officers. Gideon zoomed in, his finger ghosting over the trigger. Akral's voice boomed across the ridge, a garbled symphony of vibrations that rattled the stones beneath Gideon's feet. Even without translation, the tone was unmistakable. Confidence, mockery. The warlord was gloating. He watched Akral raise one clawed hand, releasing a cloud of pale spores into the air. The Virek officers below bowed their heads as the spores settled over them like glowing ash. Gideon could almost hear the unspoken message, "Earth is broken. Resistance is futile." Gideon's heartbeat slowed, the storm's chaos fading into a distant hum. His world narrowed to the rifle in his hands, the crosshairs aligned with the base of Akral's skull, the only vulnerable point. He took a breath, held it, and began to apply pressure to the trigger. Movement. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw them, venquils, 3 of them, slithering out from beneath the ridge. Their exposed rib cages spread open like grotesque jaws, bone shards glinting like rows of teeth. They had picked up his scent. Not now. God, not now. The first venquil lunged, claws scraping the stone as it leapt toward him. Gideon twisted, firing a shot into its torso. The creature's ribcage exploded outward, spraying bone fragments and black ichor across the rocks. But the other 2 closed in fast, their guttural growls blending with the thunder. Gideon swung his rifle like a club, slamming the stock into the second venquil's skull. The impact sent the creature reeling, but it wasn't dead. The third one was already upon him, jaws snapping inches from his throat. He jammed his combat knife into its neck, twisting until he felt the blade scrape against vertebrae. The venquil gurgled and collapsed, twitching as its bioluminescent veins dimmed. He didn't have time to breathe. The second venquil recovered, its maw splitting wide in a final, desperate lunge. Gideon grabbed the barrel of his rifle and fired point blank. The shot tore through the creature's skull, leaving a smoking crater where its face had been. The storm swallowed the sound of the gunfire, but the fortress stirred. The living walls quivered, sensing the disturbance. The Virek officers below shifted, their mandibles clicking in agitation. Akral raised his head, the glow of his neural veins intensifying. Gideon scrambled back to his position, blood dripping from a gash on his cheek. He wiped his eyes clear, blinking through the haze of rain and pain. The crosshairs found Akral's head again, but now the warlord was moving, pacing along the platform, barking orders. His exposed neural cluster flickered beneath the base of his skull, barely visible in the storm's dim light. Gideon's hands trembled. His breath was ragged, his muscles screaming from exertion. Steady. Focus. He exhaled, forcing his mind into silence. Time slowed. Akral paused, his back to Gideon, the vulnerable spot fully exposed. This was it. Gideon squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, a single perfect crack that cut through the storm. The bullet struck true, tearing through the warlord's neural cluster with surgical precision. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still. Akharal's body shuddered, his limbs twitching as the biotic armor spasmed around him. Then, with a guttural roar, he collapsed to his knees. His mandibles twitched violently, expelling clouds of spores that hissed as they hit the stone. The officers below screamed in unison, a chorus of rage and disbelief. Akharal's massive form convulsed, his veins flashing erratically. His flesh began to bubble and warp, the biotic systems collapsing in on themselves. The warlord let out one final agonized screech as his body imploded, collapsing into a pool of glowing ichor. Chaos erupted. The fortress groaned, its living walls thrashing like a dying beast. The Virek officers scattered, their coordination shattered. Gideon watched as the once mighty war machine of the Virek dissolved into madness. He exhaled, his vision blurring as exhaustion dragged at his limbs. His cheek burned from the acidic rain, and his fingers were slick with alien blood. But he had done it. One shot. A scream echoed from below, and Gideon's radio crackled to life. It was Branford's voice, breathless and triumphant. "Graves, the fortress is unraveling. We're pushing forward. You did it." Gideon allowed himself a brief, grim smile. He reached for his pack and slung his rifle over his shoulder. But the fight wasn't over yet. He turned, glancing once more at the writhing chaos below. The warlord was dead, but the war was still alive. He started the descent, ignoring the pain in his legs and the sting of acid rain on his skin. The ridge trembled beneath his boots as the Virex fortress began to collapse. The storm raged on, but the laughter of the Virex was gone. Only the storm remained. The fortress was dying. The air was thick with the scent of burning flesh and wet stone. The living walls of the command node thrashed wildly, tearing themselves apart as biotic sinews snapped and spilled glowing ichor across the ridge. Veins of alien matter, once throbbing with coordinated life, pulsed erratically, their rhythm broken with the death of Akral. The entire structure groaned like a wounded animal, its last breath caught between rage and despair. Gideon watched from the edge of the cliff, the rain washing blood and ash from his face. Below, the Virek were unraveling. The officers had lost their cohesion, their hive minds splintered by the loss of their warlord. Some of them stood frozen, swaying as if puppets with their strings severed. Others thrashed wildly, tearing at their own bodies in confusion. A few shrieked in terror before detonating into bursts of phosphorescent mist, their biotic cores collapsing in on themselves. The once invincible army had become a graveyard of twitching limbs and broken monstrosities. Farther down the slope, resistance fighters surged forward. Human war cries echoed across the valley, raw with triumph and fury. The fighters who had spent years hidden in the shadows, hunted, mocked, and butchered, were now pouring out from every ridge and hollow, striking at the disoriented Virek with relentless precision. Gideon's radio crackled again. Branford's voice was barely audible over the gunfire and explosions. "Graves, they're falling apart. It's working." Gideon allowed himself a slow breath, his exhaustion momentarily eclipsed by grim satisfaction. Akiral's death had been the keystone, the wound that had finally broken the dam. But it wasn't over. Not for him. His legs trembled as he started his descent from the cliffside. Every step felt like dragging dead weight. The acidic rain had burned through his sleeves, leaving angry red welts across his skin. His side throbbed where the Venquil's claw had raked him, and he knew that beneath his jacket the wound was seeping. But there was no time to stop. He needed to make it down the ridge, to survive long enough to see the war truly end. The path ahead was chaos. The alien fortress continued to collapse, fissures splitting open in the ground, spilling biotic fluid that hissed and steamed as it mixed with the rain. He leapt over a widening crack, nearly slipping as his boots skidded across wet stone. Below him, something moved. A Virek officer, its form grotesquely hunched and shifting. Its biotic armor had partially liquefied, exposing the raw tissue beneath. One of its arms twitched uncontrollably, useless. Yet it still stood, eyes burning with a venomous green glow. Gideon raised his rifle, but the Virek officer let out a garbled screech and staggered toward him. Its remaining arm stretched unnaturally, the joints elongating as bone tore through muscle. He fired once. The bullet hit the officer square in the chest, punching through its exposed rib cage. The creature collapsed in a heap, its body convulsing before finally going still. For a few heartbeats, there was only the sound of the storm and the distant hum of battle. Gideon exhaled and pressed on. The slope leveled out near the base of the ridge, where the ruins of human fortifications jutted from the mud like skeletal remains. Black Hollow Ridge, once the Virec's impenetrable fortress, had become a graveyard. But the victory was not without cost. Bodies littered the battlefield, human and alien alike. Some of the fallen resistance fighters lay sprawled with weapons still clutched in their hands, their eyes open to the rain. Gideon staggered through the carnage, his vision swimming. His fingers brushed against the pendant hanging beneath his jacket, a small weathered token engraved with the initials of his fallen squad mates. He had made a promise to them, and now that promise had been kept. A familiar voice called out through the haze. "Gideon!" Branford emerged from behind a shattered barricade, his face smeared with mud and ash, but alive. He rushed forward and grabbed Gideon by the shoulders. "You did it! We did it!" Gideon's legs buckled, but Branford held him upright. "Come on," Branford muttered, half carrying him toward the makeshift med station where other survivors were gathering. "Let's get you out of this hell." As they reached the crest of the hill, Gideon turned and looked back one last time. The Virek fortress was collapsing inward, folding into itself with a sickening, wet crunch. The remaining towers crumbled into heaps of quivering flesh and blackened metal, sending up waves of smoke and alien mist. The sky above the ridge churned with storm clouds, but beneath it, the human resistance stood victorious. Their battered flags fluttered in the wind, symbols of survival against impossible odds. Gideon sank to the ground, unable to keep himself upright any longer. Medics swarmed around him, their voices distant like echoes in a dream. His vision dimmed, but he forced himself to stay awake. "Graves!" Branford knelt beside him, gripping his hand. "Stay with me." Gideon's breath was shallow, each one a struggle. "Akral is gone." His voice was barely a whisper. Branford nodded, his expression fierce. "Yeah, you made the shot. You took him out." The corners of Gideon's mouth lifted, though the effort cost him. "They laughed at us." His eyes fluttered closed for a moment, the weight of exhaustion pulling him under. "But not anymore." Branford's grip tightened. Number never again. The rain began to slow, the storm losing its fury as if the land itself had exhaled in relief. The sky above the ridge was still heavy with clouds, but there was a faint glow breaking through, a sliver of pale morning light. For the first time in years, it felt like the dawn. As Gideon drifted toward unconsciousness, he felt something strange. Peace. The ghosts of his fallen squad mates no longer whispered accusations. Instead, their faces were calm, their shadows fading into the storm. The war wasn't over, not completely. But Black Hollow Ridge had been reclaimed, and the legend of the shot that shattered the Virec's grip would spread across the resistance like wildfire. Somewhere in the gathering quiet, Gideon thought he heard the sound of laughter again, but this time it was human, the sound of the living. And then, for the first time since the war began, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like victory.